Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, December 6th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. denies Amnesty conclusion on Gaza genocide. So this is as expected. The U.S. on Thursday rejected a 296-page report from Amnesty International that concluded Israel is conducting genocide in Gaza. State Department spokesman Vedant Patel said, quote, "We disagree with the conclusions of such a report. We have said previously and continue to find that the allegations of genocide are unfounded," end quote. So U.S. officials have repeatedly denied that Israel's committing genocide. And of course, they're not going to admit that they are aiding and abetting and funding a genocide because they're implicated in this. And Amnesty is calling for the U.S. and other countries that supply weapons to Israel to cut off the weapon shipments, to stop being complicit in genocide. And the U.S. is by far the biggest supplier of weapons to Israel. There was a report from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, from earlier this year that found Israel imports 69% of its weapons from the U.S. and 30% from Germany. So the U.S. and Germany are the two heavy hitters, but the U.S. is by far the biggest weapon supplier. And this has been the pattern of the Biden administration over the past year, is to deny what's happening in Gaza, deny the atrocities that are happening so they can ensure that the weapons continue to flow. As we've covered a lot, they're in violation of foreign assistance laws that prohibit military aid to countries that use American weapons to violate international law. And they also prohibit military aid to countries that purposely block humanitarian aid. It's very clear Israel is doing both of those things. And then the third thing that a lot of people don't talk about is there are foreign assistance laws that prohibit military aid to a country with nuclear weapons that does not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The U.S. gets around that by not acknowledging that Israel's nuclear weapons exist. But when it comes to the war crimes and the blocking of aid, the State Department put out a report earlier this year claiming that it was likely Israel is violating international law, but we don't have the evidence. So this Amnesty report, they looked at 15 airstrikes that they examined and investigated between October 7th, 2023 and April 20th, 2024. And in those strikes, they found no evidence that there were any military targets, and said that 334 civilians, including 141 children, were killed. So Patel was asked about this in the briefing, kind of in the context of, so the U.S., what evidence can Amnesty look at that the U.S. can't look at, essentially? Can't you access the same evidence that they can? And Patel, what did he do? He deferred to the Israeli military. He said, quote, "I will defer to the IDF to speak to its specific military operations," end quote. And then the reporter said, "So do you just take, is all your investigation just what the IDF says to you?" And Patel said, no, that's not the case. But there was a report recently from the Washington Post that said there's about 500 incidents of Israel unnecessarily killing civilians that the State Department is supposed to investigate under this new policy that they put in place before October 7th. And that report said none of those reports have been, they're supposed to investigate them and then take action. Well, they dismiss any of them, and the only evidence that they're basically using is what the Israeli military, they're just asking the Israeli military about all these incidents. So it is right that, they're just letting the Israeli military tell them what happened. So Israel, of course, denied that they were committing genocide, claiming that it was a fabricated report that's entirely false and based on lies, and they called Amnesty a deplorable and fanatical organization. In Gaza, Palestinians said that the conclusion from Amnesty came too late. So this is a Gaza resident named Abu Anas Mustafa who spoke to Reuters while attending a funeral in Khan Yunis and said, quote, "It is the 430th day of the war today, and Israel has been carrying out massacres and a genocide from the first 10 days of the war," end quote. All right, so the next one here, Israeli attacks on Gaza kill 48 Palestinians over 48 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Thursday that Israeli attacks killed 48 Palestinians and wounded 201 over the previous 24-hour period as relentless strikes continued. So there's a really horrific attack. The strikes on Thursday included a drone attack right outside the Kamal Adwan hospital in Beit Lahia, northern Gaza, the city that's been under total siege. The strike killed a 16-year-old Palestinian boy who was in a wheelchair. And you could see the aftermath here. This is kind of a picture from a distance. But you could see the 16-year-old kid in the chair killed by this Israeli strike. And he was the only one killed, a teenager in a wheelchair. And the health ministry said that the boy was killed while on his way to the radiology department. Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, the director of the hospital, he was recently hurt by an Israeli attack. He said that 12 others, including medical staff, were wounded by the Israeli strike. And you can see there's someone else laying next to the kid in the wheelchair. So Beit Lahia is one of the northern cities that's been under a total Israeli siege since early October as part of an ethnic cleansing campaign. The Israeli military said Thursday that 18,000 Palestinian civilians were evacuated from Beit Lahia, meaning they were forcibly displaced. So the IDF said that. You know, they're just openly marching these people out, and we have another story on that. It's just absolutely horrific. And the IDF has been demolishing all the buildings in the city, so they have no place to return to. So this is ethnic cleansing. I mean, there's no other word for it. And again, Israeli media has acknowledged this. The general's plan, you know, it uses the word cleansing that they're following here. So Israeli strikes also targeted Gaza City, killing at least 25 Palestinians, according to Al Jazeera. And children were among the bodies pulled out of the rubble. So the daily slaughter continues. And the next one here, death march from Beit Lahia. So this is an article from Dropsite News written by Hossam Shabat. He is a Palestinian journalist in Gaza, and he was in Gaza City, and he interviewed some of the thousands of Palestinians who were just marched out of Beit Lahia. And, you know, you look at this crowd, what do you see? You see women and children. And this is pretty rough stuff here, so I'm just going to read his whole report. It's not too long. The Israeli military forced thousands of Palestinians in Beit Lahia in northern Gaza to flee from one of the last remaining shelters and surrounding homes in the besieged town in the early hours of Wednesday morning, sending men, women, and children on an hours-long death march under heavy artillery shelling and gunfire. Thousands of displaced families had been taking shelter in the Abu Taman school complex in Beit Lahia in a last-ditch effort to remain in the town amid a brutal extermination and expulsion campaign conducted by Israeli forces in northern Gaza over the last 2 months. Israeli troops assaulted the school complex, shelled and bombed the area, and issued expulsion orders through quadcopters fitted with loudspeakers, according to witnesses, forcing terrified families outside in the middle of the night, leaving much of their scant belongings behind. Civilians were forced to walk for an hour and a half along the Salah el-Din Road, the main thoroughfare running through the enclave, before being forced to pass through an Israeli checkpoint. Witnesses described tear-streaked children covered in dust running panicked in streets as warplanes and drones roared overhead. Some pleaded for water, but Israeli soldiers refused to give them anything and instead poured water on the ground in front of them to taunt them, according to witnesses. At the checkpoint, Israeli troops separated the men and detained them as their families screamed in desperation. Witnesses described children clinging to Israeli tanks in a desperate attempt to stay with their fathers. After the checkpoint, families were forced to walk for hours more through the day, making their way a harrowing 10 kilometers south to Gaza City. Some of the wounded fell on the road with no hope of getting treatment. Rahaf, a 16-year-old, said that she was walking with her sister in the street. She and her sister were the sole survivors in their family of an earlier strike that killed 70 people. She said, quote, "Suddenly my sister fell due to the bombing. I saw blood pouring from her, but I couldn't do anything. I left her in the street and no one pulled her out. I was screaming, but no one heard me, end quote. You see these pictures here. This is Hossam interviewing some of these displaced families, and look at what they're doing. They're sitting out in the rubble, just under a blanket, no shelter or anything. When those who made it finally arrived, they collapsed in the streets, exhausted. Children cried from hunger and thirst, and mothers shivered from the bitter cold with no shelter or safe place to go. Mohammed, who lost 2 family members in an airstrike at the beginning of the military campaign 2 months ago, said, quote, "We don't know what to do. We left our homes, and here we are living in the open, and no one is helping us. We are dying slowly here," end quote. And then he just gets into how this comes after 2 months after they started this ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza, announcing the evacuation. So I didn't realize this. There's numbers here. 2 weeks ago, the UN estimated that between 100 and 131,000 people had been displaced from North Gaza Governorate to Gaza City since October 6th. So from these northern cities to Gaza City, 100 to 131,000 people have been sent there. And then as of November 18th, between 65,000 and 75,000 people were estimated to remain in North Gaza, according to the UN, accounting for less than 20% of the population there before the campaign began. So you talk about ethnic cleansing. Less than 20% of the original population remains. All right, so the next one here, Al-Qaeda-linked militants seize Syria's Hama. So this article is from Jason Ditz. Just over a week after taking Aleppo, the Syrian Islamist fighters led by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, have seized another major city. This time they have taken Hama, Syria's 4th largest city, which had not fallen during the protracted Syrian civil war. Senior commander of HTS forces Hassan Abdul Ghani said tanks were used in the assault and that hundreds of unjustly imprisoned individuals were freed from the Hama Central Prison. So they let people out of jail. Last week, HTS and allies, they seized the northern city of Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria. And Syria's army has tried to slow their advance with counterattacks, but so far has had limited success. The army confirmed that it had redeployed out of Hama after reports of intense firefighting, saying that it did so to avoid exposing civilians to battles. The army statement also reported suffering heavy losses. The HTS offensive has been backed strongly by the Turkey-backed rebels from the country's northwest. There have been multiple reports that Turkey is backing the offensive, and indeed that Turkey might even be the driving force in the recent push. HTS fighters seem increasingly well-equipped and confirmed as using tanks in their assault on Hama. When Hama was taken, most analysts say that the next major target would be the city of Homs. This is they're making some pretty serious gains here. HTS really taking advantage of the situation after over a year of Israel's war against Hezbollah and the Israeli strikes in Syria. So senior HTS commanders have made online posts announcing their gains, and one post called on residents of Homs to rise up. So that's another signal that Homs is probably next. HTS leader Abu Muhammad al-Jilani has also released a video statement threatening to expand the war into Iraq if the Iraqi militia coalition Hashd al-Shabi gets involved. So he's saying if the Iraqi PMF gets involved, they're going to expand the war to Iraq. So definitely, it's really moving pretty quickly. This offensive was launched last Wednesday, and they've already taken 2 cities. And Jason mentions the background of HTS. They were a merger of several Islamist forces, most notably Jabhat al-Nusra, which was Syria's Al-Qaeda affiliated group. And Jilani was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria. Man. All right, so the next one here, 3 U.S. troops examined for brain injuries after Syria attack. So the Pentagon said Thursday that 3 U.S. troops are being examined for traumatic brain injuries after an attack on a U.S. base in Syria that came as the U.S. was backing a Kurdish-led offensive against government-controlled villages. U.S. Central Command. So this is kind of a repeat of what I said yesterday, the rest of this article about the U.S. backing this offensive in eastern Syria. Essentially what happened was the SDF, the Al Monitor report actually said it was the Deir Azor Military Council, which is a militia that's under the control of the SDF. They said they were the main fighting force. So they launched the offensive. The U.S. gives them support, or some artillery fire, and then the U.S. bases come under attack. And then in response, the U.S. launches some other airstrikes, and they call it a self-defense strike, even though they're backing an offensive. So, but it looks like in that attack, 3 U.S. troops may have suffered traumatic brain injuries. And this goes to show, these U.S. troops are very exposed, especially with, backing things like this and everything that's happening in Syria right now. They're at serious risk of being hurt or killed. And, if Americans die, that's just going to get the U.S. more involved, and then more Americans are going to die, more violence. So it's just so foolish to stay in Syria. But as I went over yesterday, it's very clear why they're there. They want to keep Iran out of these areas, and they don't care about the American troops that are there and the risk of a bigger war. It's essentially just a tripwire for a major war, this presence in eastern Syria, this occupation of eastern Syria. All right, so the next one here, China sanctions U.S. firms over Taiwan arms sales. So China has sanctioned 13 U.S. companies involved in the manufacturing of drones and artificial intelligence in Beijing's latest protest against weapon sales to Taiwan, which have increased in recent months. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Zhan told reporters, quote, "The Taiwan question is at the core of China's core interests. In recent months, the U.S. has announced multiple arms sales to China's Taiwan region," end quote. Lin said that the recent U.S. weapon sales gravely interfere in China's internal affairs, and said that Beijing decided to take countermeasures against relevant military companies and senior executives. So they also targeted some arms industry executives. In recent arms sales, U.S. arms sales for Taiwan, arms sales that the U.S. has approved for Taiwan include support for the island's F-16 fighter jets, air defense systems, and radar systems. Taiwan also recently signed a contract to purchase 1,000 attack drones from the U.S. And besides the weapon sale, President Biden signed off on a $567 million aid package, military aid package for Taiwan. And that comes straight from U.S. military stockpiles, so they ship it right over there. And that's a form of support the U.S. just started giving Taiwan last year, so kind of an escalation. So China, they listed the 13 companies. These are like small to medium-sized companies that they sanctioned. Again, mostly involved in the manufacturing drones. And they also sanctioned 6 industry executives from some bigger companies, some Raytheon people. So this is, the reason why I wanted to write this up is just because we're seeing China. It seems like they've really increased their warnings to the U.S. about Taiwan, about these weapon sales, the other types of support, diplomatic support. The U.S. is openly planning to fight a war over Taiwan, and China's really and recently when Xi Jinping met with President Biden, he again made very clear Taiwan is the major red line. It's, they always say it's the first red line in U.S.-China relations that must not be crossed. The U.S. is just ignoring these concerns. And the Biden administration is full of China hawks. The Trump administration, even the people that are, better on Ukraine, they're all China hawks. So Marco Rubio, he's been sanctioned by China himself. So, I just don't see them reversing all these weapon sales, this march toward war with China, which, as crazy as that sounds, that's if things keep going the way that they're going and the U.S. keeps building up and planning for war, we could end up there eventually. So China, it's just one of those areas that I feel like I neglect these days with everything else that's going on, but really need to be paying attention to it. All right, so the next one here, U.S. personnel seen training elite Taiwanese Coastguard unit. So this article is from the South China Morning Post. And this goes to show some other types of U.S. support. And we've seen reports that they're going to help their Coast Guard. So U.S. personnel have been spotted training an elite Coast Guard squad in southern Taiwan as the two sides step up cooperation to counter mounting pressure on the island from mainland China. United Daily News reported on Wednesday that U.S. personnel helped the Taiwan Coast Guard Administration's Special Task Unit simulate a boarding exercise off the port city of Kaohsiung. The report was based on sightings and information from military enthusiasts, with one photo showing 3 U.S. personnel aboard a large assault boat alongside members of the STU, a paramilitary special police unit. The STU was set up in 2005 and is responsible for high-risk operations such as counterterrorism, anti-smuggling, and air rescue missions. According to witnesses, the U.S. personnel were seen aboard the STU's active-duty M109 assault boat, a newly developed larger assault speedboat, and the M96 speedboat used by Taiwan's Navy Marine Corps Special Service Company. So we've seen the U.S. Coast Guard has been sending Coast Guard cutters. They've sent them through the Taiwan Strait. They sent them to the South China Sea. They're increasing Coast Guard cooperation with the Philippines, Taiwan, a lot of the Pacific Island nations. This is just a part of the U.S. asserting its, its presence in this part of the world. It might not seem like much, but you just picture the Chinese Coast Guard, operating in the Gulf of Mexico or something, and going to different countries and training their Coast Guards and everything. And of course, there's also the U.S. naval presence in these areas as well. All right, so the next one, I left up the one from yesterday about Blinken urging Ukraine to send younger people to war. But the next one here, when I saw this headline, I thought it was satire. The Canadian government wants to send banned guns to Ukraine. So the Canadian government announced on Thursday that it was prohibiting its citizens from owning another 324 types of firearms and is working to send them to Ukraine. So the Canada's Public Safety Department said in a press release that they were expanding the list of banned firearms, and it encompasses 324 unique makes and models. You could go to the press release to see what exactly they're banning. So if you're a Canadian and you own one of these guns, you have amnesty until October 30th, 2025. And during that time, the government will implement a buyback program. And then Canadian Defense Minister Bill Blair said that the government is in talks with Ukraine about sending them the firearms. He said, quote, "We've been working very closely with our friends in Ukraine to ensure that weapons that were intended to be used in combat could be made available to them. The Department of National Defense will begin working with the Canadian companies that have weapons that Ukraine needs and which are already eligible for the assault-style firearm compensation program in order to get these weapons out of Canada and into the hands of Ukrainians," end quote. So, one thing I've always criticized like Biden and Democratic politicians for is wanting to take our guns here in the U.S. or, pass gun control laws while they're dumping weapons into Ukraine. And again, this is just like almost like a parody. They're going to confiscate weapons from law-abiding Canadians and ship them over to Ukraine, where there's a huge black market, where there's very little oversight for military aid. We've seen Pentagon Inspector General reports, like I mentioned in the article, finding that some weapons had been stolen by criminals, volunteer fighters, and arms traffickers. Some U.S. military equipment and other Western military equipment has ended up in the hands of these openly neo-Nazi militias like the Russian Volunteer Corps, which are these Russians who fight for Ukraine, and they're openly neo-Nazis. And like, this is where these weapons are going. Of course, you got the Azov battalion and everything. The U.S. is openly arming them again. And so, ship them over there, dump them into Ukraine, into this horrific war that's going on. All right, so the last story here, Israeli strikes on Lebanon. Israel strikes Lebanon as ceasefire violations continue. So on Thursday, an Israeli airstrike on the southern Lebanon town of Aitarun didn't kill, injured 5 people. Nobody was killed. This was reported by Lebanon's national news agency. So, it's been daily strikes now from Israel in Lebanon. According to a tally from the Anadolu Agency, which is a Turkish news agency, they said the tally was based on reports from Lebanon's official news agency. There have been 137 Israeli ceasefire violations since the truce was supposed to go into effect last Wednesday. And earlier this week, the UN's peacekeeping force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, said there had been 100 Israeli violations. And Israeli attacks since last Wednesday have killed at least 15 people. So I know I've been going over this a lot, but it continues. The U.S. is claiming the ceasefire is holding. And this was expected because the U.S. gave Israel these assurances that they could bomb Lebanon if they deem that the ceasefire is being violated, giving them significant freedom of action. All right, that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Joseph Terwilliger, how Yoon's martial law blunder could help Trump make peace. One from Josiah Thayer, America's greatest ally cost U.S. taxpayers $310 billion. One from Kevin Gostola, Biden's legacy leaving FOIA in shambles. One from Edward Lozansky, Trump's mixed feelings team. And one from Jeremy R. Hammond, the world order is at trial at the International Criminal Court. So please go check all of that out. Check out our blog. Is this the last show of the week? It is, yeah. This week went kind of quick. Just so much happening in the world. One thing I want to encourage people to do is I always put the link to the Defend the Guard phone banking. Defend the Guard, which is the state level legislation that would prohibit the federal government from deploying a state's National Guard to a combat zone that hasn't been declared by Congress, where Congress hasn't declared war, and that hasn't happened since World War II. So it's legislation to prevent that. And the Defend the Guard, they need volunteers for phone banking. They need donations. So you could click the link in the description for the phone banking if you're interested in that. It's really, I think, some of the best way you could spend your time activism-wise. Or you can just go to defendtheguard.us, and they have a map of all the states, and you could check out the status of the legislation in your state. You could talk to your local representatives and see if you can get it going in your state. Or, I'm just always talking about kind of the negative news, but that is a great movement that's happening and making progress. So anyway, like, subscribe, comment, tell your friends about antiwar.com. I'll be back after the weekend. Thanks for listening.